What really happened to Martin Luther King Jr. after 1965? You think you know Martin Luther King Jr. You have seen the famous speech about dreams. You have learned about bus boycotts and lunch counter protests. But here is what they never taught you in school. The story you know ends in 1965, when the big laws were passed and everyone thought the fight was over. The real story, the dangerous story, the one that got him killed, that story begins exactly where your history textbook stops. The victory that changed nothing.
Now, in the particular movement that took place,
August 1965 should have been the greatest month of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. President Lyndon Johnson had just signed the Voting Rights Act into law, and this moment represented the culmination of everything King had fought for over the past decade. The brutal images from Selma, Alabama, had shocked the entire nation just months earlier. State troopers had beaten peaceful marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, while television cameras broadcast the violence into living rooms across America. That brutality had forced Congress to finally act, and now African Americans across the South would have their constitutional right to vote protected by federal law. King stood in the Capitol Rotunda as Johnson handed him one of the pens used to sign the historic legislation. Cameras flashed from every direction. Politicians smiled and shook hands. It appeared to be the triumphant end of a long and painful struggle. But King understood something that the celebrating crowds did not grasp. He knew that this victory, as monumentally important as it was, had solved only part of the problem facing Black America. The Voting Rights Act could give a black man in Mississippi the legal right to cast a ballot, but it could not give him a job that paid a living wage. Just 5 days after Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles exploded in violent uprising. For 6 consecutive days, the streets of that community burned with rage. 34 people lost their lives. More than 1,000 suffered injuries. Police arrested over 3,000 residents. The uprising shocked white America, but King understood exactly what this explosion of anger represented. Legal rights meant absolutely nothing to people who remained trapped in grinding poverty with no realistic hope of escape. King flew to Los Angeles and walked through the still smoldering rubble of Watts. He spent hours talking with young men who had participated in the uprising, and what they told him fundamentally transformed his understanding of the struggle that lay ahead. These young people expressed no interest whatsoever in voting rights. They had never been denied the right to vote in California. What they desperately lacked was economic opportunity, basic human dignity, and any reason to hope for a better future. They lived in neighborhoods where unemployment among young black men reached 40%. They attended schools that prepared them for nothing but failure. They faced police officers who treated them like dangerous criminals simply for existing in their own community. King came to a profound realization during those days in Watts. The civil rights movement had achieved its stated goals in the South, but the South represented only part of America. In the great cities of the North and West, a completely different kind of segregation held millions of Black Americans in invisible chains. This northern segregation was not written into any law book. There were no signs reading whites only above drinking fountains or restaurant doors. But the devastating results proved just as destructive to Black lives and Black futures. Black families found themselves confined to crumbling ghettos by unwritten rules that were ruthlessly enforced by real estate agents, mortgage bankers, and white homeowners who would rather see a house burned to the ground than watch a Black family move onto their street. King made a decision that would define the final years of his life: the hatred he found in Chicago.
Down in Alabama with its vicious racists.
On January 26, 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. did something that shocked both his supporters and his critics. He moved his entire family into a crumbling apartment building in one of Chicago's worst slums. The four-room apartment at 1550 South Hamlin Avenue in the North Lawndale neighborhood cost $90 per month, which was actually higher than what white families paid for much better housing in other parts of the city. The building had no lock on the front door. The entrance foyer had a floor made of packed dirt. Rats and roaches infested every corner of the structure. King spoke to reporters who came to see his new living conditions. He told them that his family did not have wall-to-wall carpeting to worry about, but they certainly had wall-to-wall rats and roaches. He wanted America to understand what millions of black families endured every single day in cities across the nation. He wanted comfortable white Americans to see that segregation existed in their own backyards, not just in the distant South they could easily condemn from afar. The statistics painted a devastating picture of life in Black Chicago. Black families in neighborhoods like Lawndale paid what housing activists called a color tax. The median rent for a four-room apartment in Black Lawndale was $97 per month. White families in South Deering paid just $73 for apartments with 5 rooms. Black Chicagoans paid more money for less space in far worse conditions simply because of the color of their skin. And the exploitation went even deeper. 90% of African Americans who purchased homes in the 1950s Chicago had been forced into predatory contracts that charged them double or triple the actual market value of their properties. King and local Chicago organizer Al Raby launched the Chicago Freedom Movement in January 1966 with a comprehensive list of demands. They called for open housing that would allow black families to live anywhere they could afford. They demanded an end to the slum conditions that landlords imposed on black tenants. They insisted on fair employment practices that would give black workers access to good-paying jobs. On July 10, 1966, King led a massive rally at Soldier Field that drew somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 supporters. Afterward, he marched to City Hall and posted his demands on the door, just as protesters had done throughout history when confronting unjust power. But just 2 days after that triumphant rally, the west side of Chicago erupted in violence. The uprising left 2 people dead and caused widespread destruction throughout the neighborhood. This was merely a preview of the brutal backlash that would soon engulf the entire campaign. King had expected resistance. He had faced fire hoses in Birmingham and state troopers in Selma. He thought he understood the depths of American racism. He was wrong. On August 5, 1966, King led approximately 700 marches into the Marquette Park and Gage Park neighborhoods on Chicago's southwest side. These were white ethnic neighborhoods populated by families of Polish, Lithuanian, and Irish descent. The residents had heard that King was coming, and they were ready. Several thousand counter-protesters gathered to meet the marchers. Some estimates placed the hostile crowd at 7,000 people. They waved Confederate flags alongside Nazi swastikas. They hurled bricks, bottles, and cherry bombs at the peaceful demonstrators. They chanted, "Kill him! Kill him," as King walked at the front of the march. Then a fist-sized stone came flying out of the crowd and struck Martin Luther King Jr. directly in the head. The impact knocked him down to one knee. He remained dazed and disoriented for several moments while his aides rushed to protect him. But then he rose to his feet and continued marching forward. By the time the violence ended, more than 30 people had been injured, including 16 police officers. Authorities arrested over 40 people from the white mob. After the march, King delivered an assessment of what he had witnessed that day. His words would become the most quoted statement from his entire Chicago campaign. King later reflected on why the Northern hatred proved so much more vicious than what he had encountered in the Deep South. He explained that as long as the struggle remained, down in Alabama and Mississippi, white Northerners could look at it from a comfortable distance. They could observe the Southern racism and tell themselves how terrible those people were. But when these same white Northerners discovered that brotherhood had to become a reality in their own neighborhoods. When they realized that true equality meant living next door to black families, then all their hidden hostilities came pouring out into the open. Mayor Richard J. Daley proved to be a far more sophisticated opponent than Bull Connor or Jim Clark had ever been in the South. Daley did not unleash attack dogs or fire hoses on peaceful protesters. Instead, he negotiated. He made promises, he signed agreements, and then he simply failed to follow through on any of his commitments. The summit agreement reached on August 26, 1966, contained impressive language about open housing, but the city never actually implemented the promised changes. By March 1967, King admitted publicly that his organization had found the job in Chicago to be far greater than they had even imagined. Ralph Abernathy later acknowledged the painful truth. Richard Daley was a fox, he said, too smart for us. The Chicago campaign had revealed an uncomfortable reality that most Americans did not want to confront, and now King was about to push them even further outside their comfort zone, the turn toward economic revolution. The failure in Chicago pushed Martin Luther King Jr. toward a more radical analysis of American society. He began speaking about issues that made his former allies deeply uncomfortable. In private conversations and public speeches, he started questioning whether capitalism itself was compatible with true equality. This was not actually a new direction for King. Back in 1952, long before he became famous, he had written a letter to his future wife, Coretta Scott, declaring that capitalism had outlived its usefulness. But now he began expressing these views openly and forcefully. At a staff meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1966, King laid out his evolving vision with startling clarity. He told his closest advisors that they could not talk about solving the economic problems of Black Americans without talking about billions of dollars in fundamental change. They could not talk about ending the slums without first acknowledging that profit had to be taken out of slum housing. He warned his staff that they were treading on dangerous ground because they were now challenging the captains of industry and the fundamental structures of American economic life. In his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, King advocated for a guaranteed annual income for all Americans. He wrote that the solution to poverty was to abolish it directly by providing income. He declared that the curse of poverty had no justification in an age of such tremendous wealth and technological capability. He explicitly identified what he called the triple evils plaguing American society. In December 1967, King announced the most ambitious campaign of his entire career. He called it the Poor People's Campaign, and it represented nothing less than an attempt to fundamentally transform American society. King envisioned a multiracial coalition that would bring together African Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, and poor white people from Appalachia. This diverse army of the dispossessed would descend on Washington and demand that the government address poverty as a national emergency. The specific demands were breathtaking in their scope. King called for $30 billion in federal anti-poverty spending. He demanded full employment programs that would guarantee a job to every American willing to work. He insisted on a guaranteed income for those who could not work. He called for the construction of 500,000 units of affordable housing every single year. He planned to bring thousands of poor people to Washington, where they would establish an encampment on the National Mall and engage in sustained civil disobedience until Congress acted on these demands. On March 18, 1968, King traveled to Marks, Mississippi, which was located in the poorest county in America. What he witnessed there shattered him emotionally. He visited a school where children were eating only crackers and slices of apple for their lunch because their families could not afford to send them with real food. King, a man who had witnessed tremendous suffering throughout his life, broke down and wept at the sight of hungry children in the richest nation on earth. He told his supporters afterward that they needed a new kind of Selma or Birmingham. And then King did something that transformed him from beloved leader into public enemy number one. The speech that ended his alliance with power. On April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. stood before 3,000 people at Riverside Church in New York City and delivered what Congressman John Lewis would later call probably the best speech King ever gave. The address was titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, and it represented King's most comprehensive and devastating critique of American foreign policy. The speech would destroy his relationship with President Johnson, cost him the support of mainstream media, and turn former allies into bitter critics. King's central argument was moral and uncompromising. He declared that he could never again raise his voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, which was his own government. The civil rights establishment turned against King. The 60-member board of the NAACP voted unanimously to condemn his remarks as a serious tactical mistake. They insisted that the civil rights movement and the peace movement should remain completely separate from one another. Ralph Bunche, who was a fellow Nobel Peace Prize laureate, publicly called King's speech a mistake. The last telephone conversation between King and President Johnson had occurred in late 1966. After the Riverside Church speech, King became completely unwelcome at the White House. The door to political power had slammed shut in his face. What King did not fully realize was that the forces working to destroy him extended far beyond angry newspaper editors and disappointed politicians. The government's secret war against King.
I was autographing books in a bookstore in Harlem in New York City.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had been monitoring Martin Luther King Jr. since 1956, but the surveillance campaign intensified dramatically in the early 1960s. The FBI became concerned about King's association with Stanley Levison, a man who had previously been involved in financing activities for the Communist Party. On October 10, 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy authorized wiretaps on King's home telephone and on the offices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. By January 1964, FBI agents were planting listening devices in King's hotel rooms in cities across the country. Just 2 days after King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington, FBI Assistant Director William Sullivan wrote an internal memo that revealed the Bureau's true feelings about the civil rights leader. Sullivan identified King as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. This was how the FBI viewed a man who preached nonviolence and quoted scripture. They considered him an existential threat to the country. On November 18, 1964, just weeks before King was scheduled to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, Director Hoover held a press conference where he publicly called King the most notorious liar in the country. This extraordinary attack from the head of the nation's premier law enforcement agency should have been front-page news for weeks. Instead, most of the political establishment simply looked the other way, while Hoover continued his crusade. But the most chilling FBI operation against King came just 3 days after Hoover's public attack. On November 21, 1964, FBI agents delivered an anonymous package to King's home. The package contained tape recordings that allegedly documented extramarital affairs, along with a typewritten letter that can only be described as an incitement to suicide. The letter, which was later traced back to Assistant Director Sullivan, told King to look into his heart because he was a complete fraud and a great liability to all Black Americans. The letter mocked his honorary degrees and his Nobel Prize, calling the award a grim farce. Then came the most disturbing passage. The letter declared that there was only one thing left for King to do and that he had just 34 days to do it. Coretta Scott King opened the package before her husband saw it. She described the tape recordings as containing nothing but mumbo-jumbo, but both she and Martin understood immediately that the FBI had sent this material. The Bureau was attempting to drive the most prominent civil rights leader in America to take his own life. In August 1967, Hoover launched a formal counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO that specifically targeted what the FBI called Black nationalist hate groups. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was explicitly included on this target list. A memo from March 1968 outlined one of the program's primary goals, which was to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the Black nationalist movement. The memo identified King as someone who could potentially become such a messiah if he abandoned his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines and embraced Black nationalism. The FBI was actively working to ensure that no leader could ever unite Black America. While the government waged its secret war against him, King's public support was collapsing, and the weight of that isolation was slowly crushing his spirit. The loneliest year of his life. The final year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life was marked by a devastating collapse in his public standing. Gallup polling showed that his favorable rating had dropped from 45% in 1965 to just 32% by August 1966, with 63% of Americans now viewing him negatively. These were the lowest approval numbers King had ever recorded. By the time of his death, a Harris poll found that 75% of Americans disapproved of him. Half of all white Americans told pollsters that King was actually hurting the cause of civil rights. 72% of white Americans and 55% of Black Americans disapproved of his opposition to the Vietnam War. King disappeared from Gallup's list of most admired men after 1965 and never returned to that list during his lifetime. Democratic Party operatives organized meetings specifically designed to counter his influence. They convened conferences of Black preachers and newspaper editors to build support for the Johnson administration's policies. Moderate civil rights leaders like Roy Wilkins of the NAACP explicitly distanced themselves from King. Wilkins even instructed local NAACP chapters that they were forbidden from using the organization's name at any anti-war demonstrations. King's personal suffering deepened alongside his public decline. He had experienced episodes of clinical depression since childhood, including suicide attempts after his grandmother's death when he was young. By 1967 and 1968, according to biographer David Garrow, King's inner circle struggled with how to address his worsening psychological condition. Ralph Abernathy, his closest friend and confidant, later recalled that King was very terribly depressed during this period. Abernathy said it was a depression that he had never witnessed in King before. Where King had once been bubbly and upbeat, he became morose and withdrawn. He grew fatalistic, convinced not only that he would die soon, but also increasingly worried that the entire civil rights movement would ultimately prove to be a failure. He turned more and more frequently to alcohol for relief from his anguish. According to those close to him, multiple glasses of hard liquor became his nightly routine. His doctors hospitalized him for exhaustion at least 4 times during this period as his body and mind struggled to cope with the relentless pressure. Death threats arrived constantly. King had lived with the threat of assassination for years, but now the warnings seemed to multiply. In early 1968, with the Poor People's Campaign still in its planning stages, an unexpected call for help came from Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation workers in that city had gone on strike, and they wanted King to support their cause. It seemed like a small detour from his larger mission, but Memphis would become the final chapter of his story, and his decision to go there would seal his fate in ways he could never have predicted. Memphis and the final days.
The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation.
On February 1st, 1968, sanitation workers Ecole Cole and Robert Walker had sought shelter from torrential rain in the back of a garbage truck in Memphis. A hydraulic compactor malfunctioned. Both men were crushed to death inside the machine designed to compact garbage. The city, which classified these workers as hourly employees without benefits, offered their grieving families just $500 for funeral expenses. Neither man had had life insurance because they could not afford it on wages of $1.60 per hour. On February 12, 1968, 1,300 black sanitation workers walked off the job. Their demands became crystallized in a slogan that would echo through history: "I am a man." Volunteers in a church basement assembled poster board signs bearing those 4 words, and workers carried them daily in marches from Claiborne Temple to City Hall. King saw Memphis as the perfect embodiment of everything the Poor People's Campaign stood for: economic exploitation, the denial of human dignity, working people treated as less than human by the systems that profited from their labor. He arrived on March 18, 1968, and addressed 25,000 people at Mason Temple, the largest indoor gathering the civil rights movement had ever seen. A march on March 28 turned violent. Windows were smashed. Police deployed tear gas. A 16-year-old named Larry Payne was shot and killed by officers. King was devastated by the chaos. Critics pounced, claiming he could no longer control his own demonstrations. The media declared his credibility destroyed. He returned to Memphis on April 3rd, despite a bomb threat that had delayed his flight. That evening, exhausted and fighting illness, King spoke at Mason Temple. The speech wandered through biblical imagery before arriving at a conclusion that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary exhaustion. "I have been to the mountaintop, and I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Witnesses said King had tears in his eyes. His aides were unsettled. The words sounded like a farewell from a man who sensed his time was nearly finished. The next day, April 4, 1968, King spent most of the afternoon in meetings at the Lorraine Motel. Around 6 in the evening, he stepped onto the balcony outside room 306. The weather was pleasant. His spirits had lifted. He joked with aides in the parking lot below. A musician named Ben Branch stood nearby. King called down to him, asking him to play "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" at a meeting later that evening. At 6:01 p.m., a single rifle shot rang out across the Memphis evening. King crumpled to the balcony floor. The bullet had torn through his neck, severing his spinal cord and major arteries. His aides rushed to him in horror. Ralph Abernathy cradled King's bleeding head. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at St. Joseph Hospital. He was 39 years old. Within hours, over 100 American cities erupted in rage and flames. What they never wanted you to know.
The more effective.
Well, I think this will happen more and more, and this has been true, that
The assassination should have prompted a full reckoning with everything King had stood for in his final years. Instead, it became the beginning of a systematic erasure that continues to this day. The radical who had challenged capitalism was transformed into a safe icon of racial harmony. The anti-war activist was remembered only as a civil rights leader who had wanted people to be nice to each other. The democratic socialist who had said capitalism had outlived its usefulness became a symbol appropriated by politicians who would have opposed everything he actually fought for. Filmmaker Ava DuVernay observed that King's legacy had been reduced to a catchphrase, 4 words: "I have a dream." The Beyond Vietnam speech, delivered exactly 1 year before his death, and considered by many scholars his most important address, remained largely unknown. His explicit critiques of capitalism, his demands for guaranteed income and wealth redistribution, his description of America as requiring radical transformation, these were excluded from the sanitized version taught in schools. When President Reagan signed the King holiday into law in 1983, he wrote private letters assuring conservative allies that only a selective version of King would be commemorated. Senator Jesse Helms led opposition to the holiday by citing King's anti-war stance as evidence of communist sympathies. Even in honoring King, his opponents worked to ensure the real King would be forgotten. In 1999, a civil trial brought by King's own family heard testimony from witnesses who had never been called in the original criminal case. The jury deliberated for less than 1 hour before concluding that the assassination had been the result of a conspiracy involving elements of the Memphis Police Department, the FBI, and other government agencies. This verdict received almost no media coverage. Most Americans never even heard about it. King's daughter Bernice has criticized the ongoing misappropriation of her father's legacy as beyond insulting. She urged people not to take excerpts from her father's words, but to study him holistically, to understand the complete man rather than the sanitized saint. Today, when you see politicians quoting King's dream of a colorblind society while opposing every policy that might actually create equality, you are witnessing the erasure in action. When corporations celebrate his birthday while fighting unions and paying poverty wages, you are seeing exactly what King had predicted would happen. The real Martin Luther King Jr. died fighting for garbage workers making $1.60 an hour, not just for the right to sit at lunch counters. He died calling for revolution, not mere reform. He died with 75% of his own country turned against him, abandoned by former allies, surveilled by his own government, and convinced that assassination was not a question of if, but when. That was the King they did not want you to know. That was the King whose final words still challenge everything about the America we have built in the decades since his death. Did you know all these details of King's life? Let us know in the comments.